what pro-choicers call fake clinic. Places where trained ultrasonographers do ultrasounds and the staff hand out baby clothes and help with budgeting and hook women up with medical care at actual clinics and other medical facilities and things like that. Those are the bad kind of fake clinics. The good kind of fake clinic is one that does abortions, even if the woman ends up dead. This is Christina with the Sisyphean Journal, and today is February 20th. Anybody who's followed this blog knows that one of my pet peeves is that the abortion lobby is always getting their knickers in a twist about pro-life pregnancy research centers, which they call fake clinics, because they don't usually have doctors on staff. If the woman needs medical care that has to be provided by a doctor, they hook her up with a doctor. They don't pretend to be doctors. And oh my God, their ultrasonographers are actually trained. It's not just, like a Kermit Gosnell's clinic where they hire high school dropouts and here you rub the wand like this. Nope, that's not the kind of fake clinic I'm talking about. I am talking about what pretends to be a licensed and therefore inspected and safe clinic and actually isn't. Today, we're talking about a young woman who trusted one of those fake clinics and ended up dead. She ended up dead because the owner of the clinic was too cheap to hire a nurse anesthetist. He wanted his patients unconscious for the abortion procedures, so he just massively overdosed them with local anesthetic. And sometimes they'd stop breathing, but he and his staff would resuscitate them, send them on their way. None the wiser, no harm, no foul, right? Nothing to get upset about. It's not like they're handing out baby clothes or something. That would be horrible. So 23-year-old Stacy had just gotten a new job. And I read all the court documents for this case. You know how this young woman got the job? She was working drive-through at a place where a bank manager would get his morning coffee. And he was so impressed with her demeanor and her customer service that he finally said to the young woman, "I want my customers to be seeing you when they come to my bank." And he gave her a job and trained her to work at his bank. That's the kind of young woman this was. So she had just gotten that new job at the bank because of what kind of person she was, because of how she treated people. And that if you had a job that dealt with the public, you would want her being the face of your company. She went for what was supposed to be a safe legal abortion on February 20th of 1988. It probably never occurred to her that Dr. Scott Barrett's abortion clinic, which was in the basement of a car dealership, was not actually a clinic. It was a fake clinic. And of course, she would not have had any way of knowing, like I said, that the way he anesthetized patients was to deliberately overdose them on lidocaine so that they would pass out and he'd do the abortion. So Scott Barrett began the 13 or 14-week abortion at around 5 p.m. During the abortion, she stopped breathing, which happened with patients sometimes. They just revived them. But they didn't have much luck, and they finally called an ambulance. But the ambulance crew found Stacy in full cardiorespiratory arrest, and her pupils were unresponsive. The resuscitation they performed included suctioning a lot of blood out of Stacy's airway and then inserting the endotracheal tube, intubating the patient, like Dr. Barrett should have known how to do. And if he had had somebody who was properly trained in anesthesia on his staff, that person would have known how to intubate a patient. But he was too cheap to hire somebody to do that. So The medics also administered drugs by IV. They used a defibrillator, and they transferred Stacy to the emergency room where she had a racing pulse and fixed dilated pupils and was unable to breathe on her own. The hospital transfused her with packed red blood cells and gave her abdominal IV fluids, but her EEG was consistent with brain death. Stacy's parents hadn't even known she was pregnant, and they rushed to the hospital, but they found her too far gone. They agreed with the doctors to remove life support, and she was pronounced dead at 11:34 p.m. Stacy's mother said, "That night when we walked out of the hospital, I just felt like I left part of me in there. Part of me was dead. You carry a child for 9 months and something like that happens, you feel like you lost a part of yourself, a part of your body, and you're never going to get it back." And Stacy's father asked for an autopsy, which found, naturally, given the method of anesthesia Barrett chose, found toxic concentrations of lidocaine in her blood. Her serum blood level, all those hours after the lidocaine was administered, remember it was administered at 5 p.m., after her death, more than 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 6 hours later, when she died, the amount of lidocaine in her blood was still more than 5 times the therapeutic dose. And the expert who testified later calculated, given the half-life of lidocaine in the body, that the amount in her system at the time of the abortion would have been 10 times the therapeutic dose. And this is a case where I worked at Life Dynamics, and we did have copies of transcripts of some of the proceedings in court. And one of the things that Stacy's parents' lawyers did was he had an expert in anesthesiology on the stand, and he spent time establishing the man's credentials. And then he gave him a jar, legitimate medical reasons to administer however much lidocaine to a patient weighing however much Stacy weighed. So the jar had this label on it. He put it there by the expert, and he handed him a notepad and a pencil. And he said, "Doctor, I want you to write down on individual slips of paper every medically legitimate reason you can think of to administer that dose of lidocaine to a patient at that weight." And the anesthesiologist said, "I can think of none." And the lawyer's like, "Surely, doctor, with all of your experience, you have all these years of experience, you teach anesthesiology, surely you can think of some circumstance in which this would be an appropriate dose." No, he could think of none. Because the only reason you do that is to cause an overdose and knock the patient out. In order to rule out other causes of death, the coroner had examined 10 times the normal number of specimens looking for any signs of an amniotic fluid embolism. He couldn't find any evidence. He also could not find evidence of, quote, "any naturally occurring disease process which could account for Ms. Ruckman's death." So what he did find was a history of grand mal seizure and cardiac arrest after a therapeutic abortion at 13.8 weeks gestation. Stacy also suffered cerebral and pulmonary edema, which is fluid causing swelling in the brains and lungs. Pulmonary hemorrhage, which is bleeding in the lungs. Clotted and unclotted blood in her mouth and nose, and around 55 cubic centimeters of bloody fluid surrounding her lungs, and another 200 cc's of bloody fluid in her pelvic cavity. So Stacy's parents sued. The nurse that was there did testify that Barrett typically did 35 to 40 abortions a day at $300 a pop. And she and other staff did testify that Barrett just overdosed his patients, gave them enough lidocaine to knock them out. And the court found that Barrett had also falsified Stacy's records in an attempt to cover up his culpability. The medical board likewise blamed Barrett for Stacy's death, and they found fault with him for some other matters. Barrett perforated the uterus of patient SG, causing hemorrhage, and he was inadequately prepared to treat her and delayed transfer to a hospital. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like what happened to Stacy. Barrett performed an incomplete abortion on patient SC, causing an infection. He lacked hospital admitting privileges, which might explain why he dragged his butt about admitting patients to the hospital. They verified what the nurse said, which was that he routinely overdosed patients on lidocaine with no means available to deal with any adverse effects of said aforementioned lidocaine. And just to throw something fun and new into the mix, he left pre-signed prescription pads laying around where his staff could get at them. The prescription pads specifically used for controlled substances. So Barrett evidently knew that he couldn't defend what he'd done, so he didn't even bother showing up in the trial and didn't have a lawyer there either. The jury awarded Stacy's parents $25.3 million for wrongful death, $330,000 in damage, actual damages, and $25 million in aggravated damages. Now, in spite of the medical board investigation and the fact that the clinic was unlicensed, Barrett continued to work there, doing up to 40 abortions a day. The Springfield News Leader also noted that local hospitals had been failing to report his botched abortions to the authorities so that they could keep track of what was going on there. He also continued to perform abortions in the suburban St. Louis clinic he operated in partnership with Dr. Bolivar Escobedo. That's a familiar name to me. I typed up a lot of cases for Lyme 5, but I'm not going to look him up right now. The paper also noted that Barrett had left one woman saddled with $3,000 in medical bills to treat an incomplete abortion he'd performed on her, had sliced another woman's uterus in half during an abortion. And doctors who spoke to the Springfield Leader said that they were really frustrated that the state wasn't moving to shut him down, and they were tired of cleaning up his messes. One doctor said he had a patient who had been bleeding for 2 months after Barrett had performed an abortion on her, and when she would call the clinic to complain, she was told that this was normal. And Stacy's mother told the Springfield Leader that at least 10 people talked to her about bad experiences they'd had at Barrett's clinic, including one woman who approached him in a grocery store to talk to her. 3 years after Stacy's death, which is the last news article I could find, Mrs. Ruckman was still trying to get Barrett's license yanked. So much for the idea that all you have to do is trust the authorities.